August 2010. A thick fog curled over the dirt road leading into Old Hickory Forest, just beyond the edge of Nashville, Tennessee. Lieutenant Marcus Doyle's flashlight cut through the mist, its beams sweeping across a crumbling concrete wall coated in decades of dust. The basement of the abandoned house hadn't seen light or life in more than 40 years. "Center, we've got the confirmed location. Breaching the north wall. Requesting forensics in the coroner's van." Doyle's voice echoed against the damp, cold walls, mixing with the high-pitched whir of the concrete drill and the moan of wind slipping through shattered window frames. What started as a routine sweep for the department's cold case initiative had taken a sudden, serious turn. Behind this wall might be the answer to a question that haunted Nashville for 41 years, the mystery of Grace Miller's disappearance. Back in 1969, Grace was a 22-year-old woman living a quiet life, kind-hearted and gentle. One evening, she left her shift at the local pet store and was never seen again. Her green Ford Falcon was found by Radnor Lake, the driver's side door open, keys still in the ignition. But Grace herself had vanished. No note, no witness, no trace. For decades, her case remained unsolved. Labeled file, number 69421, it was quietly closed with the words, "Suspended, foul play suspected." Her parents passed away, never knowing what happened. Over time, the city came to know her name as a sad echo from the past, a haunting legend in the Franklin Pike community. Then, 40 years later, everything changed. Thanks to advancements in DNA testing and the unshaken determination of the cold case unit, the investigation got a second life. A bloodstained handkerchief, a broken necklace, a keychain etched with the initials GM together. These clues led Lieutenant Doyle to one place, this house, believed to be the last location Grace ever visited. When the team finally broke through the basement wall, they uncovered more than just human remains. They found a story buried in silence for half a century, and proof pointing to someone no one ever suspected. A former Army sergeant, a man long regarded as the moral pillar of the neighborhood. This was the same man who had attended candlelight vigils, who stood beside Grace's grieving mother at memorials, who looked directly into television cameras and urged the community not to give up hope. Before we continue with this deeply unsettling discovery, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you believe every victim deserves justice, no matter how long it takes. Your support helps us shine a light on forgotten cases like Grace's, giving voices to those silenced far too soon. The breakthrough at Old Hickory didn't just solve one cold case. It triggered a wave of revelations, because when the police made the arrest, they didn't find a stranger or a shadowy outsider. They found someone trusted, admired, a man who had quietly carried one of Nashville's darkest secrets for more than 50 years. The Grace Miller case became more than just a solved mystery. It became a symbol of persistence, of a mother's love that never faded, of detectives who refused to let the file gather dust, and of forensic science finally speaking for those who could no longer speak for themselves. This is a story of loss, determination, betrayal, and justice, though late, finally served. It was October 1969, when night fell slowly over the Franklin Pike business strip in Nashville. Neon lights bathed the wet sidewalks in shades of green and red, casting long reflections as a few late-night pedestrians hurried by. Wind chimes jingled faintly outside the laundromat, and a soft country song drifted from a diner down the block. At 7:30 p.m., Green Hill's Pet Haven began closing up for the night. Grace, the last employee on shift, turned out the lights, locked the front door, and slipped the keys into her sweater pocket. Petite, with soft brown hair, she moved quickly, like her thoughts were somewhere else. One man walking nearby would later say he saw her stop at a payphone on the corner. She set down her bag, picked up the receiver, and made a short call, just over a minute. Her voice, he recalled, was low, trembling like she was trying to reason with someone. When the call ended, Grace stared at the street for a moment, took a breath, grabbed her bag, and headed toward the parking lot. The street lamp above caught a glint in her hair. A waitress at a nearby cafe later said that was the last time anyone saw her. Grace's light green coat fluttered in the wind as she disappeared into the rows of parked cars. Then, nothing. No car ignition. No slamming doors. Just silence. At first, the Millers thought Grace had stopped to see a friend. But by midnight, her mother, Patricia, began to worry. She called the store. No answer. Called her friends. They hadn't seen her either. By 1 a.m., Patricia grabbed her coat and took the family car, slowly driving through Franklin Pike. She stopped at the diner. The gas station. The empty parking lot. She called out for her daughter into the darkness. Only crickets answered. By 2 a.m., she stood in front of the Nashville Police Department, hoping for answers, not knowing she was walking into a mystery that would last a lifetime. In the soft glow of the duty room's overhead light, a young officer looked up to see a middle-aged woman standing at the counter. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale and dazed. She placed both hands gently on the counter and said, in a steady but quiet voice, "My daughter didn't come home." The officer reached for his pen and began logging the report. Female, 22, missing after leaving Green Hills Pet Haven, Franklin Pike. The room was nearly silent, just the scratch of the pen on paper. When he finished the last line, he paused, noticing the woman still standing there, her hands now clasped tightly. He looked up and said softly that someone would be sent to check first thing in the morning. As Patricia walked out of the station, the fog had thickened. Streetlights glowed dimly through the mist, blurring the car windows as she drove away. By morning, the city was wrapped in heavy gray clouds. A chill hung in the air, and the trees along Franklin Pike dropped dry leaves, rustling in the wind. 2 officers were dispatched to Green Hills Pet Haven right after sunrise. The store was still closed, its glass door locked, the closed sign swaying in the breeze. Through the window, they could see rows of empty cages and open pet food bags left on the counter. They asked around the neighboring shops, but most of the owners shrugged. Grace often worked late, they said, and no one paid much attention to when she left the night before. But one woman who ran the grocery store 2 doors down recalled something. She'd seen Grace take a phone call just before leaving. Her voice raised slightly like she was upset. The woman hadn't heard the words, but remembered how Grace's voice had trembled, breaking now and then. After that, she grabbed her purse and left quickly, without saying her usual goodbyes. Police checked the payphone booth on the street corner, the one Grace had used. The receiver hung loosely from its cradle, the cord fraying. It looked forgotten. Nearby, a strip mall security guard mentioned that around 7:30 p.m., he'd heard an unusually loud engine behind the shops. Not the kind of sound you'd expect from a small car. Heavier, deeper, almost like a truck or military vehicle. By the time he stepped out to look, only headlights were visible, curving around the bend near the gas station. The back of the shops opened into a gravel lot, empty except for a few elm trees and scattered leaves. Officers spotted fresh tire tracks in the damp ground, partly covered by fallen leaves. They followed the tracks toward a metal dumpster behind the pet store. The air smelled of rust and stale animal feed. That's where a young officer noticed something catching the light, a broken silver chain tangled in the trash. The pendant was heart-shaped, engraved with the words, "Tommy Grace." Next to it lay a half-written receipt for cat food, the final line cut off mid-word. Under the morning light, scratches were visible on the charm, and the clasp looked stretched, as if it had been yanked. They placed it carefully in an evidence bag and kept looking. Beneath the dumpster, they found a used cigarette filter, a Lucky Strike, still tipped with red ash and not yet wet from the overnight drizzle. A small detail, but worth noting. That brand was commonly used by military personnel at the time. As word of Grace's disappearance began to spread, several co-workers arrived at the store. One young woman said that just before closing, Grace had mentioned wanting to settle things with Jack tonight. Jack Rowland, Grace's husband. A sergeant at the military recruiting center just 2 miles from the store. They had been married less than a year. Friends described Jack as quiet, but possessive. He often checked Grace's phone and questioned her friends. That afternoon, police drove to their home in suburban Brentwood. A small, tidy house. The lawn was neatly trimmed. An American flag hung still from the front porch. Jack answered the door calmly. He said he had heard about Grace going missing that morning, and wanted to help in any way he could. He claimed he was home alone the night before and hadn't spoken to Grace. While one officer asked questions, the other noticed a pair of military boots by the door, the soles still caked with dark mud. In the garage, Jack's '66 Ford had a thin layer of dust, but the exhaust pipe showed signs of fresh use. Jack explained he had started the car that morning. With no warrant, officers could only note what they observed. As they walked away, one officer glanced back. Jack was still standing in the doorway, smoking. The smoke curled slowly in the air around his head. The scent of Lucky Strike drifted faintly on the breeze. Later that day, Lieutenant Edward Grayson reviewed the preliminary report. He studied the broken chain carefully, then said, almost to himself, "If he gave this to her. This isn't just someone running away." The afternoon faded into quiet. Nashville moved on as usual, but to those working the case it was clear, from the hurried phone call to the tire tracks, from the chain to the cigarette, this was no longer a simple missing person report. The second morning of the search brought damp air and a thin drizzle. As weak sunlight hit the wet pavement along Franklin Pike, officers continued combing the area. Then a call came into dispatch. A man out early for fishing had spotted an unfamiliar car parked along the roadside near Radnor Lake, more than 2 miles from the strip. Lieutenant Grayson left immediately, accompanied by 2 officers. The road to the lake was empty, silent, but for the crunch of tires over gravel and the distant call of birds beyond the tree line. At the second bend in the road, they saw it, the turquoise Ford Falcon. Its body lightly frosted from the morning chill, pulled far over to the right, as if it had stopped suddenly. The driver's door was ajar. The key still hanging in the ignition. Lieutenant Grayson approached slowly, using a handkerchief to open the door. He leaned inside, scanning the interior. It was strangely clean. The driver's seat had been pushed back, farther than Grace, who was petite, would have needed to reach the pedals. On the passenger seat lay her sweater coat, the one she often wore. It was folded neatly. No mud, no stains. The gear was in park. The radio was off. The dome light didn't turn on. It felt more like a display than a real scene, as if someone had deliberately arranged it before walking away. An officer opened the trunk. Inside were only a few pet grooming tools and an old newspaper. No obvious signs of struggle, nothing missing. But just as Grayson stepped back, the sunlight shifted, and something caught his eye. A dark streak ran along the edge of the driver's door, down to the running board. Cracked mud mixed with gravel and leaf bits. He measured the streak. It matched the height of an adult shoe brushing against the panel. Nearby, under the damp roadside soil, a single clear footprint stood out. A man's boot, larger than Grace's size by at least 2. Thick, serrated tread, military style. The sharpness of the edges meant it had been made after the rain. It was fresh. A short distance away, they spotted a fading tire track. Grayson crouched down, used a thin knife to loosen the dried earth, and carefully bagged it. "This isn't her car," he murmured. "Someone else was here." Another officer radioed for backup, requesting a 200-meter lockdown of the area. Soon patrol cars arrived, blue and red lights blinking through the trees, reflecting on the still surface of Radnor Lake. Grayson walked around the Falcon, examining each angle. No skid marks, no signs of panic braking. It had been driven here and parked on purpose. He opened the back door. The floor was clean and dry, faintly smelling of gasoline and pet hair. Grace had often rescued strays, taking them to the nearby clinic. Under the back seat, he found something. A business card from the Nashville recruiting center. No notes, no handwriting, just a plain card, the place where Jack Rowland worked. Grayson slipped it into his pocket silently. Crime scene photographers moved in, capturing the scene from all sides. As Grayson stood there, mist still hugging the landscape, he took in the details, and none of it fit the picture of a young woman simply walking away. At the end of the road, a few locals began to gather. A reporter stepped forward and asked, "Is this the missing person from Franklin Pike?" Grayson answered briefly, "We're checking out a vehicle." He didn't want rumors spreading. Not yet. Sunlight grew stronger as the team completed the diagram. Car placement, footprints, tire marks, distance to the forest edge. One technician collected a long strand of brown hair caught on the rear window, likely Grace's. It would be tested, though everyone knew 1969's tools were limited. Grayson stared at the key still in the ignition. Was it left behind in a rush, or placed there on purpose? Either way, the truth felt closer and more unsettling. As the team wrapped up, he looked one last time toward the trail leading into Radnor Lake, mist still hanging low. In his mind, the scattered pieces, a strange phone call, a broken necklace, an engine heard in the dark, and now this oddly staged vehicle began forming a new shape. This wasn't just a disappearance. Someone close to Grace had been involved. By early morning, sunlight stretched across Radnor Lake's surface. The Ford Falcon sat behind yellow tape. The air smelled of gasoline, wet soil, and cold steel. Grayson returned with the forensic team for a full sweep of the scene. He signaled the photographer to document everything: tire impressions, surrounding debris, angles of entry. Then he pulled a nylon bag from his kit and began collecting soil samples from both front tires, where dried mud, gravel, and old leaves clung together. Under the door edge, he spotted a short fabric thread, gray-green, synthetic, about 2 inches long, possibly from Grace's clothing, or someone else's. In the back seat, a young officer found a small white handkerchief. It had a dark brown stain in one corner. Under morning light, the mark caught a reddish tint. The group fell silent. "Bag it," Grayson said quietly. He didn't want to speculate. Not yet, but something about it felt important. The most important find since they'd started. Next, the Falcon was jacked up for undercarriage inspection. Thick mud clung to the rear tire, darker than the lake's soil. Grayson scraped a sample. "Not from here," he noted aloud. The car had come from somewhere else. The windshield was dusted evenly, but the hood looked recently wiped. Another detail that didn't match a spontaneous disappearance. By the time the forensic team finished, Grayson had the vehicle towed to the department's crime lab. He lingered behind for a moment, looking toward the quiet lake path where weeds swayed gently in the wind. In his mind, the details kept aligning. A rushed phone call, unusual engine sounds, a broken chain, now a perfectly clean car, seemingly relocated. That afternoon, in the temporary forensic room at the Nashville Police Department, samples were spread out across metal tables. Technicians began their preliminary analysis, limited by 1969 technology, using microscopes and simple chemical tests. The soil sample from the tire showed shell, fragments and gravel consistent with Old Hickory Boulevard, a limestone heavy, area nearly 1.5 miles from Radnor Lake. Grayson leaned in. If the mud didn't match the lake's ground, the Ford had passed through Old Hickory first. He traced the map from Franklin Pike to Old Hickory to Radnor Lake, a short route, convenient for someone wanting to mislead. The gray-green thread was synthetic nylon. The tech commented, "Like the kind used in work uniforms." "Could be Grace's," Grayson said, eyeing the thread closely. "She wore a uniform at the store." But the way it was stretched, fraying at the ends, told him this wasn't normal wear and tear. It had been pulled, not worn down. His gaze shifted to the handkerchief resting in the petri dish. The stain on it, a dark brown smudge, remained unidentified. The tech applied phenolphthalein. It gave a faint positive result. Blood. Not enough for typing, but enough to confirm it was biological. Grayson stood still for a moment, eyes locked on that tiny streak. The soft clinks of metal tools echoed through the quiet lab. In his mind, he saw Patricia again, the mother at the counter, voice trembling. "My daughter didn't come home." Now, the evidence whispered what everyone feared. Grace may have been harmed. That evening, Grayson returned to his office. The desk lamp glowed over the city map stretched across his desk. He picked up a red pencil and traced a line, from Green Hills Pet Haven to Radnor Lake, the route Grace's car had taken. Between the two lay a quiet stretch of Old Hickory Boulevard, lined with old buildings, rarely used, easy to pass through without being seen. He leaned back, eyes closed, picturing it. Grace leaving work, meeting someone she'd arranged to see on that phone call, getting into the car, driving through Old Hickory, and disappearing. Her car, he believed, had been dumped at Radnor Lake. to throw them off. Someone wanted us to believe she left on her own, he murmured. But everything in that car says otherwise. As the evidence samples were sealed and filed for storage, Grayson signed off. He didn't know these small pieces. The thread, the soil, the handkerchief, would sit untouched in a police vault for over 4 decades, waiting for technology to catch up. But in that fall of 1969, what he had was already enough: a too-clean car, mud from another location, a stretched thread, and a faint bloodstain. To him it was clear. Grace Miller didn't disappear by choice. Word of the abandoned Ford spread fast across Franklin Pike. Inside the department, details moved more carefully, but one name surfaced again and again: Jack Rowland. Almost every friend or co-worker asked about Jack first when told Grace was missing. Though they'd been separated for some time, the relationship had never fully ended. Jack Rowland, a sergeant recruiter at the Nashville Armed Forces Center, worked less than 3 miles from Grace's store. People who knew him described him as stern, exact in speech but distant, and at times, controlling. Grace had told friends Jack often called her unexpectedly, checked up on who she was with, even followed her after shifts. Grayson reread those accounts and knew it was time to speak with Jack directly. That afternoon they visited the Rowlands' home in suburban Brentwood. The house was a single story, neatly kept. Yellow leaves had settled under the porch, but the lawn was trimmed clean. Jack opened the door on the second knock. He wore a crisp white shirt and khakis, creases still sharp from ironing. His appearance was almost too perfect. "I know why you're here," he said before anyone asked. "My wife's missing." "I'm worried too." Grayson took note of how he phrased it. Not Grace's name, just "my wife." They stepped inside. The living room was spotless, everything arranged carefully. On the coffee table sat their wedding photo. Grace's side of the frame faced down. When asked about the night Grace vanished, Jack said he was home, reading the paper, then went to bed early. No one else had been there. "We needed some space," he added. "I didn't call her." His voice was calm, too calm. His eyes never stayed long on the time-specific questions. Grayson brought up the strange phone call Grace had made before she left work. Jack simply shrugged. No idea. Maybe a friend. Every answer came the same way: steady, practiced, emotionless. As they spoke, Grayson spotted the military boots near the front door. The soles were thick, damp with dark mud, a clay-like grit that looked like what they'd found on the Ford Falcon, and there it was again, the faint scent of a lucky strike. Cigarette, the same type found at the parking lot behind the store. He didn't comment. Instead, he asked to see the garage. Jack agreed, leading them down the hallway. Inside, a dark gray Ford sat parked. A layer of dust covered the body, but the tailpipe was marked with fresh black soot. On the tool bench, everything was lined up carefully. Among the tools hung a military-issue dagger, polished blade, leather hilt. Grayson lifted it with gloved hands. No blood, but faint smudges along the edge, as if it had been wiped clean. "What do you use this for?" he asked. "Army keepsake," Jack answered. "Just for display." The response came quickly. Too quickly. One officer opened a nearby closet and noticed a uniform inside. The pants were streaked with mud. Jack claimed he'd been gardening over the weekend. They couldn't take anything, not without a warrant. All they could do was observe. As they left, Grayson looked back. Jack stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching. Not a word, just tracking them as they walked away. In the patrol car, Grayson's partner asked quietly, "You think it's him?" Grayson didn't answer right away. He stared out the window. Trees blurred past in the fading light. Yellow leaves blowing across the boulevard. "He's too composed," he finally said. "Innocent people get nervous. Guilty ones stand at attention. But he knew a gut feeling wasn't enough to charge a man, especially a military sergeant. No blood. No witness. No clear evidence. Just a car, a few traces of mud, and a husband with no alibi. Back at the station, under the soft yellow light of his desk lamp, Grayson opened a new file. He scribbled the first note on the cover: Jack Rowland. Closest relative. No confirmed alibi. Recommend surveillance. He closed the folder, then sat in silence, staring at a wedding photo of Grace, her smile still bright. Her hand wrapped around the man now suspected to be the last person who ever saw her alive. 2 days after police first spoke with Jack Rowland, new information led Lieutenant Grayson back to the quiet Brentwood neighborhood where the Rowlands lived. A local grocery store clerk had come into the station, claiming he'd seen Jack with a girl shortly before Grace disappeared. She wasn't Grace. According to the clerk, the girl was young, blonde, and dressed like a high school student. He'd never seen her before. Police identified the girl as Linda Carson, 17, who lived just 2 houses down from the Rowlands. The Carson family lived modestly. Her father worked as a mechanic. Her mother took night shifts at the hospital. When police knocked, it was Linda who opened the door. Her expression was timid, eyes shadowed by exhaustion. She looked like she hadn't slept. Inside the small living room, the faint scent of disinfectant in the air, a wall clock ticking steadily, Grayson sat across from her. He kept his voice calm and steady. "Linda, we just have a few questions about Jack Rowland. Do you know him?" Linda gave a small nod, said they were neighbors, sometimes saw each other in the yard but weren't close. Her voice was even, but her hands were gripped tightly on her knees, her knuckles turning pale from pressure. Grayson asked if she'd seen Jack recently. Linda looked down at the floor. "No, I don't remember," she said quietly. The hesitation caught Grayson's attention. A glance passed between him and his partner. After a pause, Linda added, "He's polite. He asks how I'm doing. That's all." Grayson shifted the conversation gently, asking about the night Grace disappeared. Linda said she was home, watching TV with her mom. But when her mother was questioned separately, she confirmed she'd been on night shift that evening. "When I left the house," her mother said, "Linda was studying. I don't know if she went out." That gap, that small inconsistency, changed the direction of the interview. Grayson opened his case file and placed a photo on the table. Jack Rowland and Grace on their wedding day. He spoke softly. "Did you know they'd been having arguments recently?" Linda pressed her lips together and shook her head, but her eyes darted away. A drop of sweat rolled down the side of her face. As he left the Carson home, Grayson was sure of one thing: the girl was holding something back. The very next morning, another tip came in. A gas station attendant near the neighborhood had seen Jack just days before Grace vanished. "He wasn't alone. I saw Sergeant Rowland getting gas with that blonde girl," the attendant said. "Not his wife." They were sitting in the car, talking and laughing. That was October 20th, 3 days before Grace went missing. Grayson returned to the Carson home with that statement in hand and a printed photo of Jack from military records. Linda answered the door again, her face pale, her sweater hanging loosely on her frame, hair pulled back in a rush. This time, there was no avoidance. When Grayson mentioned the sighting at the gas station, Linda didn't speak for a long moment. Then finally she sighed. "He said he needed help running an errand," she admitted. "That's all." "We've talked a few times," she added. "He tells Army stories. They're interesting." Her tone slowed, like she was realizing she'd already said too much. Grayson asked, "Did he ever talk about his wife?" Linda nodded barely. "He said she doesn't understand him, that they fight a lot." The more she spoke, the clearer it became to Grayson. Linda was trying to protect someone. Or maybe herself. He looked at her carefully. "Did you leave the house the night Grace disappeared?" She shook her head, but she didn't meet his eyes. "What did Jack tell you that night?" No response, just silence and the ticking of the clock. After a long pause, Grayson stood. "If you remember anything, let us know. This isn't a small matter anymore, Linda." As he stepped out into the street, she stood in the doorway, watching the police car drive away. Her shadow stretched long across the damp sidewalk. In the rearview mirror, Grayson saw her still standing there. His gut told him Linda's silence wasn't meaningless. She could be the link. The last person to see Jack Rowland before Grace vanished. That evening, in the investigation office, Grayson laid a map of Nashville across the table. He marked 3 red dots: Green Hills Pet Haven, the spot where Grace's car was found, and the Rowland home. He circled the Carson neighborhood. A triangle began to form, linking the missing woman, her husband, and the young neighbor. This wasn't just a disappearance anymore. It was something deeper. A web with one woman gone, one man hiding something, and a teenage girl caught in a story she didn't fully understand. 2 days later, the forensics lab sent in their preliminary analysis of the mud collected from Grace's car tires. The results showed limestone-heavy soil, consistent with the terrain along Old Hickory Boulevard. The same area Grayson had suspected, about 1.5 miles from where the Falcon had been found. He didn't wait. On a cloudy morning, Lieutenant Grayson and 2 officers headed to Old Hickory. The air was thick with the scent of wet leaves and wood smoke. Back then, the road was quiet, with only a few scattered houses and old wartime warehouses, most long abandoned. As the cruiser rolled deeper into the valley, the silence grew thicker. Just the steady hum of the engine echoing between the hills. Turning onto a dirt path near a boarded-up house, Grayson spotted it. Faint tire tracks, half sunken into the clay. The pattern in the mud was unmistakable. That same thick, serrated boot tread they'd found near Radnor Lake, only this time the mud was fresher. Someone had passed through recently. The house sat between 2 lines of bare elm trees, its brick walls cracked and its roof sagging on one side. The front door creaked open in the wind. Shards of broken glass and damp newspaper clung to the porch like forgotten memories. Grayson slipped on gloves and gently pushed the door open. The smell inside hit immediately. Mildew, damp wood, and time. The floor creaked beneath every step. The living room was nearly bare, save for a broken-legged chair and a torn curtain swaying over the window. A beam of light swept down the basement stairs. Cold air drifted upward. Dust hung in the flashlight's glow. On the concrete floor, overlapping shoe prints stood out, one large, one smaller. Grayson crouched. "Not a woman's," he said quietly. "One adult, one teenager." The team exchanged glances. Jack Rowland and Linda Carson. In a dark corner, beneath a pile of broken bricks, something faintly metallic caught the light. Grayson reached over with a tool, brushing the debris aside. A broken necklace, half of a silver heart pendant. He bagged it silently, pulse quickening. Nearby, on a rusted nail, a scrap of light green fabric hung from a wooden post. The edges were frayed. It matched the uniform Grace wore at Green Hill's Pet Haven. They searched the basement thoroughly but found no blood. The floor had a few faint scratches, possibly from something heavy being dragged, but it was hard to tell. Grayson ordered photographs, soil samples, and measurements of the basement space. Back upstairs, he stepped out the rear door into the yard. A narrow path led toward the main road, just wide enough for a vehicle. In the soft earth, faint tire marks were visible beneath decaying leaves. The route fit too well. This wasn't random. Someone had brought Grace's car to Radnor Lake to mislead them. Grayson stood on the porch, breath fogging in the cold air, staring into the woods. "She was brought here," he said softly. An officer looked up. "You think she was held here?" "At least for a while," Grayson replied. "This house, it knows more than it's saying." Before leaving, he ordered the house sealed and posted as a potential crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind as officers moved out. In the rearview mirror, Grayson watched the house fade into mist. Bare trees surrounded it like sentinels, and in his mind, the picture began to form. Mud from Old Hickory. A torn pendant, a fabric thread, 2 sets of prints. Grace Miller hadn't vanished at Radnor Lake. She'd been brought here first, and whatever had happened, it had been erased, piece by piece. The next morning, a thick envelope from the U.S. Army arrived at the Nashville station. Jack Rowland's full military file, stamped, sealed, marked confidential. Grayson opened it at his desk. The pages were yellowed, but the type was clear. And early on, it became obvious Jack's cold composure wasn't just personality. It was trained behavior, the calculated stillness of a man conditioned to suppress emotion. In the behavior section, Rowland had been reprimanded for aggressive conduct. Verbal altercations. Even one incident involving a female medical staff member slapped during a disagreement. The matter had been handled internally. No charges. Just a docked commendation. Under personal relationships, the file noted patterns of possessiveness, a controlling nature in romantic settings. Grayson thought back to what Grace's friends had said. He always needs to know where I am, who I'm with. Further down, a psychological profile written by an army doctor caught his eye. Subject prone to violent reaction when feeling betrayed or losing control. Jealousy. Low impulse restraint. Manifests anxiety when threatened by perceived abandonment. Grayson folded the paper slowly. Rain tapped softly against the office window. The pattern was growing clearer. A husband losing control. A wife quietly trying to step away. That same afternoon, Grayson drove to the recruiting center where Jack worked. Jack's office was small and neat. A few photos of new recruits were pinned to folders on the desk. One colleague recalled that on the night Grace vanished, Jack had left early. He looked irritated, the man said. Said he had personal matters to handle at home. No one saw him return that night. In the back of a drawer, the same colleague still kept a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, Jack's usual brand. Grayson eyed the familiar packaging, recalling the spent filter found behind the pet store. The invisible threads were tightening. As he left the center, dusk settled over Nashville. Grayson didn't head straight back to the station. Instead, he parked a short distance from the Rowland home. Through the curtain slits, he could see light glowing in the dining room. A shadow moved. Jack, seated at the table, phone in hand, speaking quietly. Then another figure appeared. Briefly, Linda Carson, her blonde hair, unmistakable in the faint light. Grayson's grip on the steering wheel tightened. If Grace had known about Jack and the neighbor girl, it might have been enough to drive him past the point of control. He remembered the broken necklace found in the abandoned basement, the yanked silver chain stretched unnaturally, and the way Grace's car had been positioned at Radnor Lake. Too clean, too deliberate. Everything felt like someone trying to erase the truth and still leave behind a final scene to be noticed. That night, Grayson sat alone in his office. The military files were spread across his desk, yellowed pages filled with clipped reports, notes, timelines. Together, they painted more than just a story of service. They showed a man shaped by strict discipline, trained to follow orders, but never taught how to lose. In Grayson's mind, Jack Rowland was no longer a decorated sergeant. He was a live grenade, and Grace Miller, the one who unknowingly pulled the pin. Still, it was only theory. There was no confession, no body, no direct witness, the broken pendant, the green fabric, the mud-stamped boot prints. They all pointed in the same direction, but not far enough for charges. Grayson turned off the light. His office sank into darkness, except for the quiet red glow of a cigarette ember. Outside, the rain continued falling, washing away the last traces, just as Jack Rowland had done. One careful footprint at a time, months passed. Nashville moved into the early weeks of 1970, and the case slowly slipped into quiet. 3 months after searching the house in Old Hickory, no new evidence had surfaced. The woods around Radnor Lake were scoured, but nothing emerged. No more fabric, no bones, no signs. Every lead hit the same wall. Grace was gone, and nothing had been left behind. Lieutenant Grayson refused to let go. He re-interviewed friends, co-workers, neighbors. Most had nothing new. Some didn't want to talk. The Carson family had shut their door entirely. Linda no longer appeared. Her father said firmly, "My daughter's not involved." He barely cracked the door. Linda never came out again. Meanwhile, Jack Rowland still walked into the recruiting center each morning in full uniform, cigarette in hand, calm, unreadable, as if nothing had ever happened. After a few weeks, even the press quieted. The Nashville Banner had run a headline, "Young woman vanishes after evening shift." But there were no updates to follow. No body, no arrest, just a name fading into silence. Grace Miller became one of many missing in a fast-growing city. A story without an ending, but Grayson couldn't stop looking at her photo. In April 1970, Grayson received the order. The case would be archived. Handed off to the Davidson County Sheriff's Department. He didn't argue. He just gathered everything, interview transcripts, photos, lab notes, Jack's military file, tire track reports, and clipped them into one large folder. Case 69421, Grace Miller disappearance. At the records desk, an archivist stamped the file. Red ink marked the top. Suspended. Foul play suspected. That afternoon, Grayson drove to Radnor Lake one last time. The water was still. A few mallards drifted across the surface, barely disturbing the silver-gray mirror. He stood at the bend where the Falcon had been found. Gravel crunched beneath his shoes. The damp wind carried the earthy scent he remembered from that basement. There was no proof. But in his gut, Grayson knew. Grace was gone. Without a body, there was nothing more he could do. As he left the station that evening, he paused beside the filing cabinet where the case was now stored. He rested his hand on the cold surface. "I'll be back," he whispered. Then he turned off the light. Inside the darkness, file number 69421 sat quietly among thousands of others, half-told stories, missing names, unanswered questions, and so Grace Miller's case became what it had been creeping toward all along, a cold case, a quiet mystery carried by Nashville's years, waiting for someone with time and luck to return to it. The archives of the Davidson County Sheriff's Department sat deep in a basement where fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Flickering across rows of steel cabinets, dust lingered in the air. In one of them sat a thick, weathered file, stamped 69421, Grace Miller. For 40 years, no one touched it. Until one quiet morning in 2010, Lieutenant Marcus Doyle walked into the basement holding a list of long-neglected cases and a coffee mug. His habit was to read each file slowly, letting the pages speak like a story left unfinished. In Grace's file, one small note caught his eye. Biological evidence retained. He paused. Then carefully opened the seal. Inside was a fogged plastic evidence bag. A white handkerchief, a green thread, a few faded Polaroids of a basement, and a car parked alone. The handkerchief's brown stain had faded into the fabric, barely visible. But under the desk lamp, Doyle studied it like a photograph from another life. In that moment, Grace Miller wasn't just a name anymore. She became a face. A shift worker who never made it home. The next morning, Doyle drove to the state DNA lab in Knoxville. A technician accepted the sample, slicing off a small corner of the cloth and resealing the rest. "If there are any skin cells or dried blood," she said, "we'll find out who it belonged to." Doyle nodded, watching the vial disappear behind the lab door. It was the first time in 4 decades that anyone had touched the evidence tied to Grace Miller. While waiting, Doyle spread out everything he had. The old Polaroids, a map of the Radnor Lake Road, the position of the car, the scattered prints in the dirt. Then he cross-referenced those points with current satellite images, piece by piece. The story was beginning again. Franklin Pike, Old Hickory Boulevard. And Radnor Lake still held the same spaces between them, unchanged by time. As if only the color of leaves had shifted, not the quiet tracks left behind. Together, those places told a story, a short journey, the final leg of Grace Miller's path, and how someone used her car not to escape, but to confuse. That afternoon, Lieutenant Doyle visited the department's photo archives, requesting the only enlargement of the old basement in the abandoned house along Old Hickory. The photo showed what Grayson had once described, the broken half of a necklace and faint scratch marks on the floor. But as Doyle leaned closer, sunlight caught a strange shape in the far corner of the image. A shadow, possibly a partial shoe print, or blurred mud. Uncertain, he ordered a new copy made. In that moment, he understood what Grayson must have felt in 1969. Back then, the tools were missing, not the truth. A week later, Doyle returned to the lab. The forensic technician handed him an envelope. Inside were just a few lines, but they were enough to change everything. Male DNA, a match to Army. Records for Jack Rowland, female blood, are confirmed as Grace. Miller Doyle's fingers tightened around the paper. It was like a locked door had finally opened, one that had waited for 40 years. What had once been instinct was now science. That night, Doyle sat quietly in his office. Outside, the rain tapped gently against the glass. On the desk, Grace's handkerchief rested under the golden desk lamp, beside the faded Polaroids. He ran a finger lightly over the old stain. In his mind, he pictured her, stepping out of the pet store under the soft glow of a streetlight, unaware that a scrap of cloth would become her last voice. 3 days after submitting the sample, the lab called. It was mid-morning. Doyle's coffee still steamed beside him when the technician's voice came through the line, trembling with urgency. "Lieutenant Doyle, the DNA results are in. There's more than one profile." He stood immediately. "Go on." "The first trace is female, a full match to Grace Miller, confirmed with the family's 1984 reference sample. The second, male, a 99.8% match to Jack Rowland, from his military records." The office around him fell quiet. Doyle turned to the window. Rain swept across downtown Nashville like it had in the past. Only now it had delivered something, proof, not a hunch, not a story. The DNA from that handkerchief, the one tucked under the floor mat in Grace's abandoned car, confirmed what Grayson had always suspected. Someone had been with her that night. And that someone was her husband. Doyle drove straight to the lab. There, the technician opened the sample drawer and showed him the small cut piece of fabric. The rest of the handkerchief, carefully sealed, remained intact. Next to it was a simple report, just numbers. But those numbers said more than any confession ever could. She explained the male DNA had been recovered from a mix of dried blood and epithelial cells, not from casual contact, whoever had been that close. Was there when the injury happened. Doyle didn't speak. In his mind, he saw the moment unfold. Grace reaching for help, bleeding, the handkerchief falling to the floor, carrying traces of them both. Later, in the investigation room, Doyle called in the cold case unit. He turned on the projector. The screen lit up with the old crime scene photos, then the enlargement of the necklace. One image after another. "This," Doyle said, placing the lab report on the table, "is the next piece." On the video link, a forensic analyst from Knoxville joined in. "We've taken one more step," she announced. "We tested the dried blood trace on the silver necklace found in 1969. It's a match to Grace Miller." Silence fell over the room. For the first time, everything aligned: the victim, the suspect, the locations. Like magnetic filings snapping toward one center point, Doyle leaned back in his chair, rubbing his brow. "After 40 years, he said softly, "we finally have a physical link to the suspect." It was more than science. It was the fulfillment of a promise, the one Grayson had whispered before the file was closed. That afternoon, Doyle returned to the archives. He pulled every document, the Polaroids, hand-drawn maps, original statements. He laid them out carefully on the table. At the center, he placed the handkerchief and the silver half-heart necklace. Sunlight filtered in through the window, touching them like something sacred. He pictured Grace wearing that necklace the night she left work, taking the phone call, walking into the night, and the small stain that would outlast time itself. Night settled. The office hallway glowed with dim yellow light. The scent of old paper and cold coffee hung in the air. Doyle took a red pen and circled one name on the original suspect list: Jack Rowland. From this point forward, every lead would converge there. The only goal now was to complete the chain of evidence, to close the final gap, and finally, obtain the warrant. This wasn't just a disappearance anymore. It was officially a homicide investigation. Before leaving, Doyle looked up at the photo of Grace on the board. Her gentle smile, her calm, steady eyes. He spoke quietly, almost to her. "We found him." Then he turned off the light and stepped into the hall. The office door shut behind him with a soft echo, the sound of a case finally beginning to speak after 4 decades in silence. The next day, as sunlight poured into the cold case unit, Lieutenant Doyle had a new plan ready. The DNA had drawn the path. Now, it was time to follow it. Jack Rowland wasn't just a name on paper anymore. He was the last known person to be with Grace Miller before she vanished. But Doyle needed one final piece to complete the chain: the original crime scene. the location where everything had started. He took the broken silver necklace half, the one Lieutenant Grayson had recovered from the old basement in the abandoned house, and sent it to the state mineralogy lab. Though tarnished by time, a fine trace of brown soil remained in the groove where the necklace had snapped. It had stayed sealed for over 40 years. At the same time, Doyle submitted the old mud sample taken from the tires of Grace's Ford Falcon, stored in the 1969 evidence file. His goal was simple: determine whether the dirt from the car and the necklace came from the same place, the abandoned house on Old Hickory Boulevard. As results were pending, Doyle recreated the travel path from October 23, 1969. He placed Grayson's hand-drawn map next to a digital overlay of the current area. Franklin Pike, Old Hickory Boulevard, Radnor Lake, all within a 2-mile triangle. If the Falcon had passed through Old Hickory before being left at the lake, that meant the house wasn't just connected, it was likely where Grace had been taken first. 3 days later, the lab called. "We've got something." "Lieutenant," the technician said, "the soil inside the necklace groove matched the tire mud exactly. Same calcium quartz, same limestone, same red clay signature unique to the Old Hickory area." No question. Doyle stood silently, gripping the phone. The dust Grayson had collected decades ago under a flickering lantern had finally confirmed it. Both the necklace and the car bore the mark of the same place: the forgotten house. That afternoon, Doyle gathered his investigative team. He pulled up the map on the projector, this time with an added red line tracing Grace's final known route. She left the pet store at 7:25 p.m., traveled down Franklin Pike, turned onto Old Hickory. Then her car was found at Radnor Lake. "This path," Doyle said, pointing to the red line, "proves she never went straight to the lake. Her car passed through the Old Hickory house first." He paused. "Someone drove her car after what happened. And it wasn't her." All eyes followed his finger as it moved between the 3 locations. "She was moved," he said. "Likely placed in another vehicle, possibly Jack Rowland's." The projector cast a reddish glow on the walls, like shadows bleeding across the map. The team nodded quietly. They all knew what it meant. Real scene of the crime had never been the lake. It was the house left untouched for years. Doyle tapped his pen. "Against the table, we narrow our search radius to a 3-mile circle around Old Hickory," he said. "If Rowland lived or worked nearby back then, we'll find the connection." Night fell as the team filtered out of the building. Doyle remained alone, the room quiet except for the soft hum of the projector. The 3 red dots on the map glowed like silent markers, where Grace worked, where she vanished, and where the truth still waited beneath layers of time. He thought of Grayson, how the older man had once stood over the same map, haunted by the same questions, but this time, science had stepped in. The dirt clinging to a necklace and a tire had carved a path no one could deny. Just a small circle of roads, spinning between Franklin Pike and Old Hickory Boulevard. Outside, Nashville buzzed with neon lights. But in Doyle's mind, all he saw was an empty road in the dark, red clay on tires and the image of a young woman turning off the main street and into the unknown. That soil, the same that had covered her for decades, was finally pulling her story back into the light. 6 months after the soil results came in, Doyle knew the physical evidence had reached its limit. The necklace, the handkerchief, the matching soil, all pointed to Jack Rowland, but it still wasn't enough. What he needed now was a human voice, a witness who could place Rowland at the scene. Only one name remained in the old file: Linda Carson, the 17-year-old neighbor from 1969. Doyle began the search. It took dozens of calls and record checks, but eventually he found her, living in Memphis, nearly 3 hours away. She had changed her last name after marriage, now working quietly as a receptionist at a small veterinary clinic. No criminal record, no contact with Jack Rowland in decades. Doyle called her first, introduced himself, but on the other end of the line, there was only silence. When he said Grace Miller's name, the woman finally replied, her voice rough. "I have nothing to say. 3 days later, Doyle drove to Memphis. He waited outside the clinic for nearly an hour before she came out. Linda, now 58, still small in build, hair fading gray, carried the same nervous air mentioned in Grayson's notes. As Doyle stepped forward, she flinched. "I knew you'd come," she said, barely audible. "But it's been too long. That story died with them." Doyle didn't argue. He quietly reached into his bag and placed 2 items on the table of a small coffee shop down the block: a faded Polaroid of the Falcon at Radnor Lake, and a printed copy of the DNA results. "You should see this," he said gently. She hesitated, then took them. Her hand shook slightly when she read Jack Rowland's name. They sat in silence, the paper between them. Then Linda finally exhaled. "I was young, and I was stupid. I thought he just needed someone to talk to," Linda began quietly. "Someone who'd listen. I was only 17. I didn't know anything about the world." Doyle said nothing, giving her space to continue. Her voice trembled slightly, blending with the sounds of cars passing outside the cafe window. "That night," she said, "I saw them arguing. Grace was standing by her car. Jack walked up and grabbed her arm, pulling her away. She told him, 'Jack, stop,' and pulled free. Linda paused, eyes unfocused, like she was back in that moment. I was scared. I hid behind the trees. I didn't move. Then I heard the car door slam, and the engine start. After that, nothing." Doyle leaned forward. "You're sure it was Jack Rowland?" Linda nodded. "Yes. When he turned, the light hit his face. I'll never forget it. He looked around, like he was checking if anyone had seen. And I think he saw me, because the next day he came to my house. He told me, 'Don't get involved in grown-up business.'" She took a shaky breath. "I was terrified. When the police questioned me, I lied. I thought if I said the truth, he'd come after me, or my parents." Doyle felt a chill run down his spine, not just at what she said, but at the thought that this case might have been solved 40 years ago, if a frightened teenage girl hadn't been silenced. "Linda," he said softly, "you can make it right now." She looked up, eyes wet but steady. "Fixing it won't bring her back, will it?" "No," Doyle replied, "but it's still in time, for Grace." He set a small recorder on the table. "Tell it again, everything, just like you did now." She nodded. Her voice grew steadier as the weight of years began to lift. The recording lasted over 20 minutes. In that time, she recounted every detail: Grace's last words, the slamming door, the sound of the car leaving into the dark. When she finished, Doyle stopped the recorder and saved the file. He didn't need an oath. Linda's voice carried enough truth and 40 years of regret. Before leaving, she reached across the table and gripped his hand. "Do you think he's still alive?" Doyle looked at her, voice low. "I don't just think. I know." Linda stared out at the quiet street where the late Memphis sun spilled pale gold over the pavement. "If you ever find him," she whispered, "tell Grace." "I'm sorry." On the drive back to Nashville, Doyle replayed the recording. Linda's voice filled the car. "Jack, stop!" The sound of those words, frozen in time, still made his heart pound. For the first time, the case wasn't just a file. It was a living story, one of silence, fear, and voices finally being heard. When Doyle reached Nashville, he didn't go home. He went straight to the old house on Old Hickory Boulevard, the same place Grayson had searched decades earlier. This time he wasn't there to look. He was there to uncover. The next afternoon, gray clouds rolled across the Tennessee hills. The forensics team arrived with ground-penetrating radar and excavation tools. The area around the abandoned house was covered in tall grass, hiding what was left of the old paths. Faded yellow paint still streaked across the crumbling walls. Police line. Doyle stood by the doorway, staring at the building. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of rust and soil. It felt like standing in 1969 again, where Grayson's flashlight had once swept the same shadows. Inside, the radar hummed softly as the technicians scanned along the basement floor. The monitor showed smooth green waves, then a sudden dark curve broke the pattern. "There's something here," the technician said. Doyle stepped closer. On the screen, a half-circle anomaly showed dense, compacted soil, different from the surrounding ground, right against the north wall. He nodded slowly. "Drill here," the bit whirred, spitting fine dust into the air. The smell of decayed lime stung the room. When the hole widened, the soil behind it was darker, compacted on top but looser underneath. They switched to hand tools, carefully scraping away layers. Then came a faint metallic clink. Doyle knelt and brushed the dirt aside. A rusted keychain emerged, heart-shaped, engraved with 2 small letters, GM. His chest tightened. He held it gently in his palm. "Grace Miller," he murmured. No one answered. Only the steady scrape of shovels filled the room. A few inches deeper, they uncovered an old rope fragment, brittle, frayed, nearly turned to dust. It was coiled around something faintly solid beneath the soil. Moments later, a small, pale bone surfaced, the size of a fingertip, fragile as porcelain. Doyle froze. The shape was unmistakable. He raised a hand. "Stop digging," he ordered quietly. The team sealed the area and marked the coordinates. Even one fragment was enough. The house was no longer a theory. It was a scene. 3 hours later, at the mobile lab, the forensic technician carefully extracted DNA from the preserved marrow. They waited as the results processed. Then, on the screen, words appeared in clean black type. Partial match. Mitochondrial DNA consistent with Patricia Miller, Grace's mother. Doyle stood still for several seconds. Then he turned to his team. "We found her," he said quietly. And for the first time in 40 years, the case that had slept in the dark began to breathe again. That night, the basement of the old abandoned house glowed under harsh white lights. The police had sealed off the entire area once again. Cameras clicked, soil was sampled, and every object, no matter how small, was carefully collected and cataloged. There wasn't much talking. Only quiet, focused work. When the GM keychain was gently cleaned and placed next to the broken half of Grace's necklace in the evidence box, Lieutenant Doyle stood still for a moment, staring at the 2 items under the lamp. 2 pieces, separated for decades, now side by side. 2 halves of a story finally joined again. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the tall elm trees. Doyle stepped out onto the creaking porch. Ahead was the road leading downhill, the one where, years ago, Lieutenant Grayson had once stood and said, "She was brought here." Now it wasn't a theory anymore. This was the place. Grace had been here. As Doyle left the scene, he placed the sealed evidence box carefully on the back seat of his car. No music played. No words were spoken. In the rearview mirror, the old house shrank in the distance, its porch lights flickering in the rain, like an old soul quietly closing its eyes. After holding its secrets for 4 decades, the house had finally spoken. The search was over. Now came justice. The next morning, Nashville lay under a heavy fog. Bare trees lined the streets as pale sunlight tried to break through. Lieutenant Doyle arrived early at the station, file in hand, freshly updated with the forensic team's overnight analysis. He laid the file down next to the map on his table, a map that had grown crowded over time. Franklin Pike, Old Hickory Boulevard, Radnor Lake, red arrows, numbered times, scribbled notes. Each mark now carried weight, clarity. Grace hadn't left on her own. She had been taken. And the man who took her, the one the evidence circled, was Jack Rowland. Doyle quietly began piecing together the timeline. This time, every step connected. At 7:20 p.m., Grace left her job at Green Hills Pet Haven. She'd just finished a short call, likely with Jack. At 7:25, a witness had seen her turning into the rear parking lot. 5 minutes later, a security guard remembered hearing a heavy vehicle engine, something like a military truck. On the pavement, the shoe print found near Grace's car matched standard military boots. The same type Grayson had once spotted in Rowland's garage. By 7:35 or 7:45, Doyle believed Grace was already in Jack's vehicle, heading down the dirt road toward Old Hickory Boulevard. It was a short drive, just long enough for a disagreement to escalate. Linda Carson's voice echoed in Doyle's memory. "Jack," Stop! Then the sound of a car door slamming. Doyle pictured it all. The dimly lit road, Grace trying to get away, Jack losing control. Inside the basement, something had happened. Her necklace had broken. Blood from both had been found on the handkerchief. And after that, silence. Grace never walked back out. Around 8 p.m., Doyle estimated Jack had left the scene. Mineral samples proved Grace's car tires had passed through the Old Hickory clay before being abandoned near Radnor Lake, a deliberate move to throw off investigators. After that, Jack likely drove back to Brentwood in his own vehicle, crafting his alibi. Doyle projected all of this on the office screen. The map, the DNA evidence, Linda's testimony, the soil match, every element now fit together like links in a locked chain. Reading calmly to the team, he walked through the timeline. 7:20. Grace leaves the store. 7:30. She's seen turning off Franklin Pike. 7:45. She's at the house. 8:00. Jack leaves. 8:20. Her car is left at Radnor Lake. Doyle paused and turned to the photo on the wall. Jack Rowland, in uniform, square-faced, upright. The kind of man who always looked in control. He thought time would erase it, Doyle said softly. But it didn't. Later that afternoon, Doyle drove across town to the Tennessee State Prosecutor's office. He carried with him a case file almost 500 pages thick. In the small conference room, he presented everything. Grace's final evening, the keychain, the soil samples, the single bone fragment, Linda's voice. The DNA match to Grace's mother. Each piece displayed on screen in sequence, the story unfolding line by line. When it ended, the room was quiet. Prosecutor Sarah Kent leaned forward. She was known for being thorough, never rushing to judgment. "Do you believe this was premeditated?" she asked. "Not an accident?" "I do," Doyle answered. Grace tried to fight. He didn't give her a chance. Kent studied him for a moment, then gave a single nod. "Prepare the full file. I'll seek the warrant." As Doyle stepped out of the building, sunlight broke through the afternoon fog, lighting the edges of his graying hair. He breathed deeply. After years of silence, the case no longer felt like just an old folder. It had become a story again, a real one, with voices, truth, and finally, justice. On the way back, he stopped at the Franklin Pike intersection, where the old pet shop once stood. A new sign hung there now. Doyle looked up and imagined Grace walking out that night in 1969, unaware her steps would echo this far. But now, through patience, technology, and truth, her story had found its way home, and it was about to end, not in silence, but with a name. Jack Rowland. 2 weeks after Lieutenant Marcus Doyle submitted his final report, the Tennessee State Prosecutor's Office presented the case to the Nashville grand jury. That morning, inside the courthouse, the room was nearly silent as Prosecutor Sarah Kent walked the jury through the key evidence, the DNA matches, soil samples, witness testimony, and the timeline connecting it all. The presentation was clear, methodical. Within the hour, the panel voted unanimously. An arrest warrant was approved for Jack Rowland, 68 years old, a former Army sergeant, charged with first-degree murder in the disappearance of Grace Miller. That same afternoon, Doyle was called to a coordination meeting with the U.S. Marshals and FBI. They confirmed Rowland was living in suburban Savannah, Georgia, using his real name. He worked quietly as a training consultant at a private recruiting center. No family, no children. Neighbors described him as distant, like someone keeping to himself, even when no one was looking for him. Before dawn on August 17, 2010, 4 unmarked vehicles arrived at a brick house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The air was heavy with fog. Lieutenant Doyle rode with team leader Will Cook, a seasoned marshal who had led many searches like this one. They parked. The porch light flickered. Cook gave the signal. 3 firm knocks echoed through the early morning stillness. U.S. Marshals, "Mr. Rowland, open the door." There was a pause. Then, without a word, the door creaked open. Jack Rowland stood there, older now, in a plain shirt, hair gray, eyes hollow. No resistance. No confusion. "Jack Rowland," Cook read calmly. "You are under arrest by warrant from the Tennessee grand jury for the 1969 murder of Grace Miller." The moment was quiet. Roland's eyelids twitched slightly, but he made no effort to speak. He simply nodded, voice low. "I understand." As the handcuffs clicked into place, he glanced at Doyle. "I figured you'd come, sooner or later." While the team conducted a sweep of the home, Doyle stepped inside. Everything was neat, carefully arranged, cold but not chaotic. It reminded him of how Grayson had once described the Roland house decades ago. On the wall hung a military commendation. Below it, a shelf with a few books and a small tin box. Inside, Doyle found a leather-handled army dagger, still marked with a battalion number. Beside it sat a worn black notebook, the edges frayed from age. He opened it. Notes scattered across the pages, thoughts that trailed off, scribbled sentences, and one that was scratched into the page hard enough to leave a tear. "I did what I had to. She betrayed me." In a drawer, officers found an old envelope, the handwriting soft and flowing. "It was a letter. Jack, let me go," it read. "I no longer love you, but I do hope you find peace. Signed, Grace." The letter was dated just 3 days before she disappeared. With the evidence secured, Roland was led outside. Neighbors peeked through curtains, watching silently as the convoy of flashing lights pulled away. Doyle sat in the back seat, facing the man across from him. Jack didn't speak. His gaze never wavered. He didn't look frightened, just far away, like someone carrying something for too long. Crossing the bridge back into Tennessee, Doyle finally asked, "Did you think about her? All these years?" Jack didn't look up. "Every night," he said softly. Hours later, as the cars rolled into Nashville, the evening sun cast long shadows across the city streets. Doyle stared out the window, thinking of Grace, how she once walked these sidewalks, unaware her story would stretch decades before finding its end. At the station, Jack was led past the flashing cameras and the crowd of reporters. "Did you kill Grace Miller?" someone called out. "Why stay silent for 40 years? Jack didn't answer. His head lowered, he kept walking, expression unreadable. Doyle followed behind, the black notebook in hand. He had a feeling it still held answers, ones even time couldn't erase. That night, the second-floor interrogation room at the Nashville Police Department stayed lit. Jack Roland sat at the center table. His shirt rumpled, wrists red from the cuffs. His eyes were tired, but alert. Across from him sat Lieutenant Doyle, alongside a supervising investigator. A camera recorded. The clock ticked past midnight, but no one moved. The only sound was the scratch of a pen on paper. For 4 hours, Roland said nothing. "Do you remember Grace Miller?" Doyle asked. "Did you see her that night?" No reply, just silence. Eyes down, Doyle waited. He knew this kind of silence. It wasn't strength. It was hesitation, slowly breaking down. Around 2 a.m., Doyle placed the DNA file and crime scene photos on the table. He spoke quietly. "Your DNA and Grace's were both found on the same handkerchief. Your prints are on the necklace she wore." "This isn't speculation anymore." Jack's eyes finally lifted. "They were bloodshot, worn down. I didn't kill her," he said. Voice low. "We argued. She fell. Hit her head." Doyle leaned forward, his voice steady. "Where, Jack?" "Where did she fall?" Jack hesitated. His eyes flickered. "At the old place," he finally said. Doyle understood. "The house on Old Hickory. Why did you take her there?" Jack lowered his head. "She said she wanted to talk." "One last time," he answered. "I thought I could change her mind. Thought she'd come back." He paused, then continued. "She said she wanted a divorce," Jack whispered. "I lost control. I don't remember everything, just..." She fell. His voice faded for a moment. And then she wasn't breathing. Across the table, Lieutenant Doyle kept his expression steady, though his voice lowered a notch. "And after that? What did you do, Jack?" Jack gave a tired, almost sorrowful smile, more hollow than defiant. "I panicked. I couldn't let them find out. I carried her down to the basement, and I rebuilt the wall." He exhaled slowly. "I thought no one would ever find her." Doyle felt his fist tighten at those words. "Where exactly in the basement?" he asked. Jack met Doyle's eyes for the first time since the interrogation began. "Behind the concrete wall. I plastered over it, sealed it with cement." He paused. "By morning, I drove her car to Radnor Lake. I just wanted people to think she left on her own. Doyle reached for the photo file. He slid it across the table. Images from the excavation site. The broken cement, the necklace, the GM keychain, the small bone fragment. You built this wall yourself, Doyle said quietly. Jack didn't respond. He just stared at the photos, his mouth twitching, lips trembling slightly. After a few long seconds, he nodded faintly. I didn't want it to end like that, he said. But I did it. Doyle stood and gave a silent signal. The technician switched the recording camera to face Jack directly. I need you to confirm, Doyle said firmly. You took Grace Miller to the abandoned house on Old Hickory. After an argument, she died, and you buried her behind the basement wall. Is that true? Jack's head dropped. His voice was barely audible. Yes, but I didn't mean for her to die. Doyle said nothing more. He nodded for the camera to be shut off. The room fell still. As Doyle gathered the files, his eyes lingered on the man across the table, a man who had held back the truth for more than 4 decades. You say it wasn't intentional, he said gently, but you built a wall to hide her. He paused. That's not an accident, Jack. That's a choice. Jack didn't look up, but before the officers led him away, he whispered one last thing. I wanted her to stay there. With me. By sunrise, the confession was officially signed and sealed. It matched the DNA evidence and witness statements, and it gave authorities enough to move forward with a full excavation order. The final search for Grace Miller was no longer about speculation. It was now about recovery. That morning, a soft mist hung over Nashville. Wind from Radnor Lake drifted in cool, carrying the scent of damp soil. The road into Old Hickory Boulevard hadn't changed much in 40 years, except for a layer of new asphalt. The house at the end of the woods still stood, leaning and tired, silent like it had been waiting. When the police vehicle pulled into the driveway, Doyle stepped out into the damp earth. His boots sank slightly into the mud. Inside, the Tennessee State Forensics team had already begun setting up. Ground-penetrating radar, bright halogen lights, plastic sheeting, everything was in place. As the team moved toward the basement, a group of crows scattered from the roof, breaking the morning quiet. The basement air was thick, musty with years of dust and moisture. Halogen beams lit the walls, highlighting old plaster patches and faded stains. Doyle stood in front of the north wall, the spot Jack had described. This is where he said, Doyle muttered. Right behind here. The GPR scanner hummed to life. Slowly, technicians swept the radar along the wall. Lines moved across the screen, soil layers, hidden shapes. Then one of them stopped and pointed. There, he said. Something's behind this section. Doyle stepped in for a closer look. A dark, curved patch had appeared on the screen, deep behind the concrete. He gave a quiet nod. Start drilling. The sound of the drill echoed sharply, reverberating off the old foundation. Concrete cracked and fell away in pieces. Lime dust filled the air. Everyone adjusted their masks and stayed focused. After nearly an hour, a hollow opening appeared, and with it, a sudden cool gust of air pushed out, carrying a scent both familiar and deeply unsettling. No one spoke. One technician knelt and began brushing away the loose dirt with a small trowel. Then, something silver caught the light. It was a chain. A heart-shaped pendant, edges caked in mud. The initials were still visible beneath the grime. GM Doyle froze. His hand curled into a fist. It was the other half of the necklace recovered, all those years ago. The one Grace had been wearing the night she vanished. More earth was cleared. The shape of a human skeleton slowly emerged. Small bones, a bent arm, and a faded scrap of green-gray fabric. Still clinging to the waist, the Pet Haven uniform. One technician whispered, "It's her." Doyle crouched down, carefully shining his flashlight deeper into the cavity. The beam landed on a rusted keychain, the letters GM faint but still visible. He picked it up, holding it gently in his gloved palm. And for a long moment, he stood in silence. Because after all this time, they had finally found her. Grace had been here all along. Faint morning sunlight began seeping through the cracks around the basement door. No one spoke. Only the quiet scrape of tools and the sound of steady breathing filled the space. Each item lifted, a shirt button, a single strand of hair, a scrap of faded cloth. Felt like a piece of someone slowly returning home. Doyle didn't take notes. He didn't need to. He just stood back, watching. Words in that moment felt too small. This wasn't just an excavation. It felt like a homecoming. When the full outline of her remains was finally revealed, no one gave an order. But everyone paused. Heads bowed. It was a moment of quiet respect. Doyle stood still, keychain still in his hand. He heard the soft whistle of wind slipping through broken windows, leaves brushing gently against the tin roof above. In that silence, it felt like Grace was speaking. Not with words, but with presence. By late afternoon, the yellow lights of the forensics van lit up the narrow dirt road. Doyle followed closely as the gurney was wheeled out, Grace's remains now gently covered in a white cloth. There was no face to see, no expression to remember. But in his heart, Doyle knew exactly who it was. The young woman who had walked away from the pet store one October evening in 1969 was finally being brought home, no longer hidden behind cold walls. As the gurney reached the grassy patch near the waiting vehicle, a gust of wind lifted the edges of the white cloth. Doyle stepped forward and placed a hand gently on the edge. Softly, just for himself, he said, "We were too late, Grace. But we came." That evening, he drove alone back into the city. Nashville's lights blurred across the windshield, but all Doyle could see in his mind was that dim basement, the broken wall, the small silver chain. Crossing the old bridge, his phone buzzed. A message from the forensics team. The preliminary DNA results were in. The bones matched Patricia Miller's DNA sample. There was no doubt now. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he eased his hands off the steering wheel and took a long, steady breath. The next day, news of the discovery spread quickly. After 41 years, Grace Miller had been found. At a brief press conference, Lieutenant Doyle stood before reporters. He looked weary, but composed. Behind him stood a large black and white photo of Grace, her young face bright, eyes frozen in time, still seeming to look straight into the camera. Doyle raised his head. His voice was calm, steady, but laced with quiet sorrow. "After 41 years, he said, "we found her." Camera flashes erupted. He didn't flinch. He didn't look at the cameras. Instead, he looked at Grace's photo. Then he lowered his head, just slightly. No closing statement, no applause, just the truth. Quietly returned to someone who had waited too long to be seen. That night, as Doyle left the scene, he slowed on the narrow dirt road that led back to the highway. The sky had turned deep black. A sliver of new moon cast faint light over the treetops. He looked back once more at the old house, now empty, the basement wall broken open. The wind moved gently through the trees. The air smelled like earth and the first chill of fall. Doyle whispered, "Rest now, Grace. You're home." And as he drove away, the red and blue lights from police vehicles still flickered softly behind him, not flashing with urgency, but glowing like a quiet farewell. A goodbye to someone who, after 4 decades, had finally been found. September 2010 arrived, and Nashville settled into early fall. Along Franklin Avenue, leaves turned gold and copper in the breeze. Inside the Tennessee State Administration Building, Prosecutor Sarah Kent sat surrounded by boxes of documents, photos, and evidence. Before her, a single photo stood upright, Grace Miller, and just beneath it, the new case file, State of Tennessee versus Jack Rowland, first-degree murder. Kent had seen many files cross her desk, but none weighed like this one. Each piece of evidence delivered by Doyle's team felt like a piece of memory being restored. The handkerchief, the broken necklace, the old dagger, the letter Grace had written, and finally, the remains. It was more than a case. It was a reckoning. Later that week, Kent met with Lieutenant Doyle in the small conference room. Together, they reviewed Jack's confession. He didn't need notes. He recited everything from memory. The words, Jack, said behind the interrogation table, the place he pointed to in the basement, the chain he saw shining in the soil. "This case," Kent said, placing her hand on the files, "will be watched by all of Nashville." Doyle nodded, calm but firm. "They'll say it was an accident," he said. "But I've seen that wall. Accidents don't need concrete." Jack Rowland's attorney, Richard Harland, began shaping the defense. He called Jack's confession a moment of panic, not intent. He claimed the fall was an accident, and Jack simply lost control, afraid of being blamed. To the public, he said this was a tragedy between two people who once loved each other, but the prosecution knew the truth was in the aftermath. The wall, the buried car, the silence. Over the next few weeks, Kent's team examined every detail. The dagger matched Jack's old unit. Traces of the same cement found on the hilt matched samples from the basement wall. And inside Jack's notebook, the restored line on page 17 said everything. "I did what needed to be done. She won't leave me again." It wasn't a direct confession, but it was enough. Kent brought together every expert, every witness, every line of evidence. Linda Carson, now 59, agreed to testify. And though her voice still shook from the memory, she knew the truth had waited long enough. When Linda Carson recalled that night, the words she remembered most were simple, but powerful. "Jack, stop!" Her voice cracked slightly when she said it during pre-trial prep. That one sentence, raw and vivid, echoed louder than any lab report ever could. Prosecutor Sarah Kent knew that moment, just one line, could hold more weight in front of a jury than pages of analysis. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Doyle sat in a separate prep room, rehearsing his own testimony. Kent needed him to walk through the details of the basement discovery, step by step. He spoke slowly, carefully, never dramatic, just the truth. "We broke the wall. We saw soft soil, the necklace, then bones. I knew it was her." When he paused, the room fell completely silent. Kent looked up from her notes, her voice quiet but firm. "Say it just like that in court." At Davidson County Correctional, Jack Rowland remained in custody. The press had already taken hold of the story, labeling him the 1969 husband. His name now linked not to love, but to possession and silence. When a reporter asked him if he regretted anything, he said only, "Too late for regret." That quote was printed in bold headlines across local papers, sparking an outcry. By December 2010, the prosecution finalized its indictment. In the official statement, Sarah Kent outlined that Jack Rowland had intentionally caused injuries that led to Grace Miller's death, then made efforts to hide the truth. Over 200 pages were filed, from excavation photos and DNA lab results to confession transcripts and mapped timelines. Then came the date that had long felt like it would never arrive. The trial, scheduled for June 2011, Davidson County Courthouse. On the day Kent signed the final court filing, she stood for a moment by the office window. Outside, the city moved as usual. Doyle's patrol car rolled slowly through the Franklin Pike intersection, the last place Grace Miller had been seen. Kent said softly, to no one in particular, "We've brought her back." She knew this trial wouldn't just be about prosecution versus defense. It was Grace Miller's chance. Her voice, stolen in silence, now returned to speak. June 2011. Over 40 years after Grace disappeared, the courthouse was packed. Reporters from across the country crowded into the building. Cameras lined the hallways. Residents who'd lived through the decades of mystery came, hoping to witness the ending to the story that had haunted their city. When Jack Rowland was led into the courtroom, the crowd fell into a hush. He looked older, thinner. His gray hair was neatly combed, posture still rigid, eyes forward. No expression. Prosecutor Sarah Kent stood, composed. Her voice was steady. Your Honor, members of the jury. 41 years ago, Grace Miller walked out of her workplace and never came home. Today, we give her back her voice. She began presenting the evidence in the order it had been found. The first slide was the white handkerchief, stained faintly with blood, the first object that had reignited the case. Then came photos of the necklace half, still coated in the same soil found at the abandoned house. Mineral samples had matched. More images followed. The broken basement wall, exposed bones, a rotted rope, and the GM engraved keychain. The room remained silent. Even the soft hum of the projector sounded like a heartbeat. Forensic expert Karen Willis took the stand. Her tone was factual but gentle. The bone DNA matched Patricia Miller, the victim's mother, with 100% certainty. The blood on the handkerchief revealed 2 DNA profiles, Grace Miller and Jack Rowland. No contamination, no error. She displayed photos from the dig. Each bone fragment, each recovered fiber, even a strand of hair. Her final conclusion? The body was buried in a curled position, wrists loosely bound. No signs of relocation. She's been there since 1969. As she stepped down, Grace's mother bowed her head, clutching her rosary beads. Her hands shook, but her eyes remained closed. Beside her, Doyle sat still, staring at a photo of the gray basement wall, the place where they'd finally found Grace. Then came Linda Carson's testimony. Now nearly 60, her voice trembled, but she spoke clearly. That night, I saw them near the car, she said. Grace was trying to pull away. She yelled, "Jack, stop!" Then he grabbed her and shoved her inside. The door slammed. I was scared, so I hid, she hesitated before continuing. I stayed quiet too long. Maybe if I'd spoken up earlier, she would have been found sooner. Kent approached gently. Linda, are you sure it was Jack Rowland that night? Linda looked straight at the jury. I'll never forget his face. The defense tried to shift focus. They argued too much time had passed, that memories fade. They claimed Jack never meant harm, just panicked after an accident. But when the jury saw Jack's 2010 video confession, the words echoed through the room. I built the wall to hide her. I just wanted her to stay there. No one spoke. When Doyle took the stand, he explained the investigation with the same steady tone. We found her where he said, the keychain. It was inches from her hand. That's not something you plant. That's something only the one who buried her could leave behind. Kent asked one final question. In your opinion, was this act intentional? Doyle glanced once at Jack. Then he answered, clear and direct. He didn't just hide her. He built a story, to make the world believe she'd disappeared. That's not panic. That's control. Jack took the stand next. Hands shaking, voice unsteady. I didn't want to kill her. She fell. I panicked. I didn't know what else to do. But no one in the courtroom seemed moved, because the truth had already spoken. From the chain, from the bones, from the silence that followed. Prosecutor Kent took a step closer, her voice steady. You built a wall, hid the body, drove her car away to make it look like she ran off. All because you were scared. Jack said nothing. His eyes dropped. His hands tightened, trembling slightly. The trial stretched over 7 days. When Kent delivered her closing statement, she looked directly at the jury. Grace Miller didn't fall. She was dragged, hidden, forgotten, and her killer walked free for 4 decades. It's time her voice is heard. The courtroom was silent as the jury returned after 5 hours of deliberation. The foreman stood, unfolded a paper and read, on the charge of murder in the 1st degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, guilty. There was no sound. Then Grace's mother broke into quiet sobs. Doyle in the front row closed his eyes. Jack Rowland didn't flinch. He remained standing, shoulders straight, no visible emotion. The judge asked if he had anything to say. Jack spoke quietly. I didn't want to kill her. I just couldn't bear her leaving. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Reporters raised their cameras as officers led him away. Outside, the summer breeze moved gently across the courthouse steps. Doyle came out last, eyes lifted to the deep blue sky. Sunlight filtered through the high dome of the building. He thought of Grayson's words. Long ago, I'll come back when I get the chance. Now, the chance had come, and justice had finally followed. The Grace Miller case was closed. The woman who vanished in 1969 had her name, her story, and her truth restored. As Doyle stepped off the courthouse steps, he said softly to no one in particular, "She waited 41 years. Now she can rest." The next morning, Nashville felt still. A kind of hush settled over the city. Newspapers delivered to porches and cafes carried one headline, "Cold Case Solved After 41 Years." Underneath, 2 black and white photos sat side by side. One, Grace Miller at 22, her eyes bright, her smile shy. The other, Jack Rowland at 68, being led away in prison clothes. The contrast was striking. Memory and consequence, captured in a single frame. Many residents remembered Jack as a respected man, a decorated veteran, a speaker at community events. He'd trained youth cadets, spoken at memorials. "Unbelievable," one veteran said on the morning news. "He taught us about honor." All that time, hiding this? News spread beyond Tennessee. National media replayed moments from the trial, the basement wall breaking apart. The necklace recovered from the soil, Kent's firm voice saying, "Justice for Grace Miller has arrived." On social media, tributes poured in. People posted Grace's photo, lit candles, and wrote messages. She was found. She mattered. She's home. Younger generations, who had never heard her name before, were drawn in, learning that the bright lights of Nashville once hid an unspoken darkness. 3 weeks after the verdict, the city held a quiet ceremony at the site where the abandoned house once stood. Now cleared, the foundation gone, grass beginning to grow back. In the center, a white marble plaque had been placed, in memory of Grace Miller, 1947, 1969. Her voice was silenced, but her truth endures. That morning, the sky was clear. Patricia Miller, now in her 80s, attended with help. She gently placed a bouquet of white daisies at the base of the memorial. "Finally," she whispered, "my daughter is home." A few feet behind her, Doyle stood with his cap in hand. He lowered his head in silence. Beside him, Sarah Kent stood quietly, watching the breeze move through the trees. No speeches, no music, just the wind and the soft hum of the city in the distance, like a slow, steady breath finally at peace. A month later, the U.S. Department of Justice released a national commendation list under its Cold Case Justice Program. Third on that list, Tennessee Cold Case Task Force, Nashville Division. Recognized for dedication, care, and persistence in restoring justice to families long left without answers. Doyle and his team were invited to Washington, D.C. for a formal medal presentation. During the trip, Kent handed Doyle a small framed photo, taken at Grace's memorial ceremony. She smiled and said gently, "You finished what Grayson started." Doyle nodded. "Not just me. This whole city, everyone who refused to forget her." The case drew nationwide attention. Cold case divisions across the country began reviewing old files. New grants supported DNA reanalysis. Forensics classes used the Grace Miller investigation as a training model. How something as small as a necklace, a patch of soil, or a lost sentence could break open a case. On one local radio show, the host said, "Some cases never really go cold. They just wait for someone patient enough to listen." That line was echoed in dozens of articles, podcasts, and documentaries in the years that followed. One evening, Doyle sat alone on his porch. The night was cool. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat beside him. Next to it, a small wooden box held a few items, a replica of Grace's keychain, the photo of the exhumation team, and a thank-you note from Patricia Miller in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for bringing my daughter home." Doyle turned on the old radio. A soft tune filled the night, Moon River. It was the same song Grace had once sung during a store gathering, according to one co-worker. Light, melancholy, floating gently through the Nashville night, like the memory of a girl once lost, now finally found. As the last notes of the song faded, Doyle leaned back in his chair. He spoke softly, almost as if to himself. Justice doesn't get lost. It just sleeps longer than we expect. Outside, an early summer breeze drifted across the porch. It carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and the last traces of rain on quiet streets. Nashville moved forward with its usual rhythm, alive with lights, music, and voices. But for those who had followed every step of this case, Grace Miller's name would forever be tied to something deeper, the belief that no crime stays buried forever. That truth, even delayed, always finds a way home. That evening, as Doyle stepped away from the porch, he paused by a framed photo on the hallway wall. A picture of him and the investigative team standing near the white marble memorial. The soft glow of his bedside lamp fell across the engraved words, "Her truth endures." He gave a small nod and smiled quietly to himself. Then he switched off the light. Outside the window, the sky above Nashville was still. A sliver of new moon floated behind thin clouds, peaceful and unmoving, like Grace Miller's spirit, finally at rest after 41 years of silence. Looking back now, her journey from Franklin Pike to Old Hickory Boulevard to Radnor Lake was more than the solving of a cold case. It became a quiet roadmap of small choices, overlooked signs, and lasting consequences. And the lessons it holds are still relevant today. Grace Miller's story reflects more than a personal tragedy. It speaks to the risks many still face in relationships, the silence of bystanders, and the incredible value of science and persistence in uncovering the truth. The warning signs were there early. Jack Rowland, once disciplined in the military for controlling behavior, had a pattern. Grace had written her plea in a letter, "Let me go free." Linda Carson heard the cry that night, "Jack, stop!" But fear kept her silent. The Ford Falcon parked near Radnor Lake was a staged scene. But it was the tiny clues, a necklace buried in soil, DNA on a faded handkerchief, and a cracked wall in an abandoned house, that would eventually bring it all back to light. These lessons aren't just about the past. They're reminders for today. First, recognize red flags in relationships. If someone constantly checks your phone, isolates you from friends, or shows extreme jealousy, that isn't personality. That's control. And it can be dangerous. If you or someone you know feels trapped like Grace once did, make a safety plan. Save messages. Share your movements with people you trust. Reach out to support services. And call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. They're available 24/7. Second, don't let fear silence you as a witness. Linda Carson lived with regret for 41 years. If she had spoken up sooner, maybe Grace would have been found earlier. Your voice today matters. Call 911 if something feels wrong. Report license plates. Note locations. The smallest detail, like a keychain or a streak of mud, could change everything. Third, believe in the power of science and in institutions that persist. Nashville's cold case unit didn't give up. They followed threads for years. They relied on long-term evidence storage, DNA advances, and cross-agency cooperation. That work paid off. When the city turned the abandoned house into a memorial site, it wasn't just about closure. It was about reclaiming a dark space and making it safe again. So look around your own neighborhood. Install lights, support watch programs. Help turn forgotten corners into safe ones, because justice doesn't disappear. It just rests, sometimes longer than we expect, but it wakes faster when we act early, speak honestly, and stand up for those whose voices were taken. If you believe every truth deserves to be found, and that no one should be forgotten, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications so you won't miss stories like Grace Miller's. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll see you in the next video, where another American mystery will be uncovered, one truth at a time.